Hello, this is Writers at Work, a podcast for readers and writers about the joys, heartaches, challenges, and satisfaction of the creative writing process. I'm your host, Jim Fusilli. My guest on this episode of Writers at Work is Peter Blauner, author, screenwriter, television producer, and journalist. His Slow Motion Riot, a book admired by no less a writer than Patricia Highsmith, won the Mystery Writers of America's Edgar Award for the best first novel. He's written and or co-produced episodes for 3 of NBC's Law & Order series, as well as for Blue Bloods on CBS. His most recent novel, Picture in the Sand, is a sprawling, illuminating work of historical fiction set in Egypt and Hollywood in the 1950s. How it came to be is a tale in itself. Peter Blauner, welcome to Writers at Work.
Thanks for having me, Jim.
Peter, I want to start with your career in journalism, particularly working with Pete Hamill.
Yeah.
What was that like?
Well, he had been one of my boyhood heroes. I grew up in New York City in the 60s and 70s. I used to read him and Jimmy Breslin in the New York Post, which was a liberal rag in those days. I was just thinking the other day that I remember reading a column by Pete where he talked about discovering Picasso right around the same time that he discovered James Joyce. And the way Picasso would drop abstract images on the canvas, the way James Joyce would drop words onto the page. And as a 13 or 14-year-old kid, I thought, that sounds cool. I ran to the library and I picked up Ulysses, and I didn't know what the hell was going on. But I knew what was going on when I read Pete's columns, which were sometimes short stories, sometimes about politics, sometimes about RFK, sometimes about Valerie Solanas, and really captured the excitement not only of the city, but of the era as well. And Breslin, very much the same, funny as well. When I was at college, I decided that I wanted to be a novelist, but I also realized I was a dumb kid and I didn't know anything. And so I went to the library. I pulled down all the books that I could find that I liked, and I looked at what the authors had done for a living, because I knew I wouldn't be able to pay the rent as a novelist. And I saw a newspaper man, magazine writer, journalist was the thing that came up most frequently. So I decided to swim in that direction.
And when you were working, first of all, how'd you get the job with Pete Hamill?
I knew somebody who knew somebody who knew somebody.
Yeah, that's the way.
Yeah, that's the way everything in the world works. That's probably how Stalin got his job.
Now, when you reach some level of ease with him, I assume at work, did you ask him about his fiction and how he managed to wear both hats?
He took me out to lunch the first day that I worked for him, and he taught me 3 things before the sandwich came that I've lived by ever since. Number 1 was, if you have an experience and you think there's any chance you're going to write about that experience, write down every aspect of that experience within 24 hours, or you will lose the detail that you need in 6 years when you're trying to make this scene come to life on the page. That has proven to be gold over the years. The second thing that he taught me, and I'm sure you're familiar with this as a journalist, is that if a question occurs to you while you're talking to somebody and it makes you deeply uncomfortable to think about asking that question, then you must ask that question, because it usually will be the beginning of a much more honest conversation. And the last thing was to always read writers who are better than you and who you can learn something from. The corollary to that, I met the Nobel Prize winner Naguib Mahfouz years later, and he said, "I've learned more from the near great than I have from the great." That's proven to be pretty important as well.
Those 3 rules, Peter, are pretty good rules to live by.
I agree.
Yeah. Was the word easy isn't the correct word, but what did you have a voice as a journalist and a voice as a novelist at the start? Were you better at one or the other? Did you find one to be more natural for you than the other?
I had to make sure that I lost my voice when I started being a journalist. I was excited as a high school student to explore having a voice when I started writing fiction because you can't really have much of a voice when you're writing social studies papers. And so great if you do, your grade is probably going to reflect that individuality. So it was very exciting. I remember the very first day I stayed home, played hooky from school to write a short story, and I slapped an Ian Drury record on the turntable and turned the volume way up, and it was okay. I'm cutting loose. But then when you go to work for a publication, whether it's the Newark Star Ledger, where I worked for a while, or New York Magazine, where I worked for 10 years or so, you're part of an organization, you're part of a machine, and your voice has to be subordinate to their voice as well. So that I had to learn how to do, and I had to put my own voice as a fiction writer in a state of suspended animation for those 10 years from the time I got out of college until I published my first novel.
Yeah. You mentioned New York Magazine. I want to talk about 1988,
Yeah.
which was a landmark year for you. You were the sole author of the Voices of New York issue of New York Magazine, which it continues to blow my mind that that responsibility was given to such a young person. Growing up across the river in Hoboken, I remember that issue of the magazine, and I was so impressed with that. I may actually have it in storage still. And at the same time or the same year, you became a probation officer.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. As soon as I finished that issue, I was like, all right, I've done the journalism thing and I've been talking about being a novelist. I'm now 27 or 28 years old, and I either can try it now and fail completely, or I can look back on this period of my life 40 years from now and go, you didn't have the nerve to do it. You never had it in you. And I thought, okay, well, I better try. I better see what I got. And I had decided that I wanted to be a realistic urban novelist early on. This is part of the attraction to people like Hamill and Breslin, and then also crime fiction in general as well. But again, even at that age, I felt like I don't know anything. I don't know anything about how the world really works. So I settled on probation officer as the job and the entry point for the world of crime that I was going to write about. But I thought, listen, I got to really immerse myself in this because you're competing with television even in 1988. And this is before cable television, before the really good stuff was on the air. I've got to get people to a level of reality that feels almost surreal because that's what it's like when you're a reporter. I mean, things happen before your eyes that you can't quite believe. So that's why I took a leave of absence from New York Magazine and I became a probation officer as a volunteer for 6 months, just so I could have the day-to-day experience, the sights, the sounds, and the smells. And there are distinctive smells when you're working in a municipal job.
And so at this point, did you have any idea that you'd be writing Slow Motion Riot? Did you have notes for it? Or were you just a blank page and you were going to wait to see what you saw to write about?
I think I had two big stories in the back of my head. One was the story of a Bronx gangster named Larry Davis, who had shot 6 cops and then went on the lam for 3 weeks in New York City. And there was a massive manhunt. Nobody knew where he was. And the story was that people in the community considered him a kind of folk hero and were protecting him from law enforcement. Then at the same time, there were these exploding municipal scandals, which probably only people our age will remember, Jim. One that started with the Parking Violations Bureau, but then encompassed organized crime, the Koch administration, with Rudy Giuliani, actually, at that point, wearing the white hat. And I thought, how do I have a story that brings together the world of white collar crime and the world of street crime And I realized, oh, the probation officer is someone who would deal with both worlds,
Uh-huh.
very much so, because everybody gets probation, especially in those days. People who had committed, attempted murder in those days, and these days they knock it down to assault, but in some cases the line's pretty thin. And people who had committed fraud and embezzlement and inside trading, and I thought that's a way to write about society itself, all within the cubicle that the probation officer inhabits. And it's still true to this very day. Donald Trump was convicted the other day. The very first thing that he had to do is he had to report to a probation officer.
So, Peter, at what point did you have a sense while you're writing, while you're beginning to implement the research that you've uncovered, did you have a sense that you had a book? And how long did it take? Well, how long was the gestation period from I'm now writing a book to having a draft that you thought was presentable?
Well, apropos what Hamill told me, I would come back from being in the field service unit with probation. This sounds like I'm telling a story, but this is what I really did. And you would be out pretty late, and they were very generous with me, and they took me around. They took me to the housing project, and they gave me a bulletproof vest, so nothing bad would happen. And then I would get home, and I'd plop myself down in front of the keyboard, and I would write down every detail that I could remember uh,
Yeah.
um, and until I had like hundreds of pages of notes. And I had taken a leave of absence from the magazine of, I think, 6 months while I did this. And it was nice of them to agree to take me back. And then I was, okay, I'll just try and force all this together into a story. And my attitude was, I'm just going to write the beginning, the middle, and in the end, and I'm not going to look back. I'm just going to go at a dead run because if you stop and look over your shoulder, the monster of self doubt and anxiety will eat you alive. And I just wanted to get to the end of the project. And then, like a sculptor, I thought, well, if the head's too big and the hands are too small, I'll just put everything into proportion. So I had the raw form of that by the time I came back to the magazine, and then I rewrote it the whole time. I was back at the magazine. I think it was a year, something like that. And I had an agent who was pretty well established, who I'd met through my college writing teacher, was a wonderful woman named Kit Reed. And he looked at it and he said, I don't think I can really sell it. And he sent it to one editor, and they didn't go for it. And I thought, oh no, I've really screwed this up. I thought, let me take one other shot at this. And I rewrote it completely. I rewrote it in an odd form that some chapters are in the first person from the probation officer's point of view, and some chapters are from the point of view of what they call his clients, the criminals, and those sections are in the third person. So it's almost like inside the cubicle and outside the cubicle, almost like a movie in which some scenes are color and some scenes are black and white. And my wife had met an agent named Richard Pine, and he was just a couple of years older than me. And I gave the book to Richard, and he said, well, there's some possibilities here. In the meantime, my wife, who I just married, and I went off to a long-awaited vacation in Jamaica. And we went to a place where the rooms did not have telephones at all. And it is obviously way before cell phones and way before the internet. And I remember they just had a switchboard and then a place where they left messages, sort of a cupboard with mail slots. And it was actually outdoors for some reason. I don't remember why. And I made a point of just pretending nothing was happening. And then one night I walked by this series of mailboxes, and I just saw one mailbox had a little pink slip in it. And I went up to it at about 9 or 10 o'clock at night, and it was a message from my agent, Richard Pine. And the message was, you did it.
Wow. Wow. Wonderful. Wonderful. I should mention that your wife is Peg Tyre, the Pulitzer Prize winning writer.
You should mention that.
I don't want to like leave the idea of this research too quickly,
Mhm.
because um, I think your level of research is what makes your work so tactile and unique. It's that old school shoe leather type of research. And when I'm reading a novel and I can sense that the author is downloading the research, I really hate that. I
Yeah.
find it to be so off-putting. But I think your novels, you blend reportage and narrative fiction in a way that it really is unique to you, Peter. I can't think of any. I'm sure there's somebody else who does it, but I can't think off the top of my head of someone who does that. Um, at what point did you think that you had the right balance of repertorial research and the flow and freedom of fiction?
Well, thank you. But the answer is I don't know. And it's a day to day issue. And that's why I write pretty slowly, because the gathering of information for research is one thing. And some things are easier to learn about than others. But it's really giving the words that lived in quality, that it doesn't feel like I'm just delivering an information dump on the reader.
Right,
Because no one wants that at all. It has to sound natural and like the character is just like part of this world and they happen to be shining a little flashlight around to show you the sights and sounds without being self-conscious about it. And that is the hardest thing to do. I published this book, Picture in the Sand, after 20 years last year. And part of the challenge was like, okay, I did 20 years of research going to Egypt and writing about 1954 and writing about Hollywood and Cecil B. DeMille and all that stuff. How do I not stop the narrative and have the characters go, well, the Muslim Brotherhood in 1954 was the prototype of Al Qaeda. No one wants to read that. No one wants
right,
a
right.
novel. How do you come up with a character's voice that can accommodate all that information and give you that realistic texture, but still make you feel emotionally kind of pulled into the story? Well, that can take a long time to work out that balance.
Yeah, and I do want to discuss Pitcher in the Sand, which I just completed and I loved.
Thank you.
Um, I want to just go back a little bit, Peter, and maybe there's a sort of staircase that got you to where you are in doing Pictures in the Sand. I want to go back to The Intruder, which you just re-released in
Mhm.
a new hardcover version. Um, Now that research, um, I mean, I don't know how you did it, Peter. I don't know how you committed to doing the research you did for The Intruder.
Well,
Could you
committed.
talk a little bit about that?
I mean, committed is the right word because several people thought I should be committed for the way I did it. The Intruder is about a middle class family, or perhaps even an upper middle class family, who are stalked by a homeless person who believes they have stolen the life that he was intended to have. But the twist is he actually may be the protagonist of the book, and the intruder of the title may not be him at all, but someone else in the book, including perhaps the person you thought was the hero of the book. And I don't think we should give too much more of it away. So part of the research was doing research into an upper middle class family and what that might look like at the time I wrote the book. But part of it was also, how do I write about a character who is, number one, homeless, number two, struggling with mental illness, number three, someone who is scary, who is a stalker, but who is also sympathetic and human at the same time. Well, that's a tough thing to pull off. And again, the only way I know how to go about things is straight at them and immersing myself the way a method actor would. So one thing I did is I got a job working at a homeless shelter for a year. So I did that for a year, and I worked closely with some of the people who were living there. The other thing I did is I spent time in the train tunnels beneath Riverside Park in Manhattan, where there were a community of they called themselves the Mole People living down there, and that was really an alternative reality that was going on. They literally had built homes for themselves along the train tracks, and they had created works of art on the walls of the tunnel, and it was really pretty trippy. Being down there. And the third thing is I became good friends with a gentleman named Lee Stringer, who had lived in a train platform at Grand Central Terminal for 9 years, who had extensive experience in the street world, in the drug world. He was working at the time for a newspaper called Street News that was by and about the homeless. And Lee was my Virgil within this world. If you remember the role that Virgil plays in Dante's Inferno, he's the one who really showed me around and explained the sights and sound. And the irony is that Lee ultimately not only got off the streets and out of the platform himself, he also established himself as a writer, and he wrote his own book, Grand Central Winter, which is a wonderful memoir. And he's still around today and still writing today. And I would urge anybody to pick up that book and really enter into a new world.
Yeah. This level of research, Peter, it's not for everyone, is it?
No.
But you mentioned something earlier that I thought was so important, and that was the smell of things.
Yeah.
Nowadays you can get anything on Google Maps. I mean, I confess that sometimes if I have a character walking down a street in a city I haven't been to in a while, I just go on Google Maps and have drag the mouse until I can see the stores and see if I still have their names right. But there are certain things you just cannot replicate, and
Yeah,
one
you
of them,
walk into an old church and it has a certain dryness, or that like you feel in your nose, or you walk into like a city office building, and it has a particular kind of mildew and mold smell. Uh,
yeah,
like puts you into a different world, or you walk into a school cafeteria and you can smell, wow, that macaroni and cheese is from 1966. And I mean, it just really creates a different environment. And
yeah,
it's you're literally transcribing reality. It's all about creating the state of mind for yourself and then creating that state of mind for the reader.
right. I remember I was entering the Vatican on doing some research, and I had volumes of notes about what I needed to see and what I needed to do. And as I walked up the steps, I suddenly realized that you could smell the Tiber,
Yeah,
and there were seagulls around the Vatican,
right.
and I had no idea that either of those things were the case. And I probably did refer to both things,
Yeah,
but it just blew my mind open to don't look for the stuff you're going to see.
right. Right. And again, AI is not necessarily going to give you the seagulls. AI is not going to give you the smell of the river. Maybe it will. Maybe it'll get, or maybe it'll give you some other weird detail. But that's the human dimension to the whole thing that a book can give you still, that I don't think even really good television shows can give you.
Right. And the thing about the novel, which I do think it takes novelists a while to learn, is that when you write that scene with that level of tactile detail, two readers are going to see it differently.
Yeah.
They're going to bring their own experience to that. And at a certain point, you just cannot make it so precise that there's no flexibility for them.
No. No.
And that is, again, this is one of the wonderful things about a novel.
Right. I think Chekhov or somebody said, like, you can say the girl reclined on a red blanket and you can see what that looks like. If you say she reclined on a red blanket that had horizontal blue stripes and had fringes and was reminiscent of an Oriental rug from this year. At a certain point, you just drown the reader, and they're like, "I can't see this anymore." It's
Right. Right.
really got to pick which details you're going to use to stand in for the whole
Yeah. Now, pictures in the sand.
picture.
Um, a picture in the sand. Yeah. Although I have so many pictures that I'm calling it pictures, and it's a picture in the sand.
Yeah,
I recall about 20 years ago, we were having lunch, and I said to you, "So, what's next?" And you said, "I'm going to Egypt to write a book about Cecil B. DeMille's making of the Ten Commandments."
right, right.
And I thought, well, that's a great idea. He'll do a great job with that, and I'll have it in my hands in the next 18 months or so. It didn't work out like that, did it?
Nope, nope, nope. Again, I thought here's this amazing historical collision, sort of like Tom Stoppart's Travesties, where you have this unlikely collection of people all in the same place at the same time. You had Cecil B. DeMille, Charlton Heston, Yul Brynner showing up in Egypt right after a revolution, right after the war with Israel, right before the Suez Crisis, right as Gamal Abdel Nasser, who some of your listeners may remember as the first Egyptian to lead Egypt since the time of the pharaohs, at the exact same time that the Muslim Brothers are trying to turn the country into a theocracy, a time of upheaval and a time also of romantic illusions, a time when America was still in love with the exoticism of the Middle East, and a time when people in the Middle East still held up America as an ideal. And I thought, oh, okay, this will be easy to write. And then it took me 20 years. And part of it was figuring out who should tell this story. It's not Cecil B. DeMille's story to tell. It's not my job to tell Cecil B. DeMille's story. He wrote his own autobiography, and also he's a world renowned filmmaker. It's not my job to tell Nasser's story. A lot has been written about him, and it's not my job to tell the Muslim Brotherhood story. And they can speak for themselves. So who's going to tell the story? And again, going back to the Jimmy Breslin of it all, I mean, and we're very far from Breslin territory, obviously, when we're writing about 1954 in Hollywood and Egypt and all that. But he wrote a column on November 23rd, 1963, after JFK was assassinated. And he didn't write about the grassy knoll. He didn't write about the conspiracies. He didn't even write about Lee Harvey Oswald. He wrote about the guy who dug Kennedy's grave. And it brought the whole thing to life again, and just gave you a new angle and a level of humanity that yards and yards and yards of other people's newsprints couldn't provide. So I always think, okay, look for the gravedigger, who's the guy who has the ground level view. And so it became a story that I told from the point of view of Ali, who's this young Egyptian guy who gets a job as Cecil B. DeMille's assistant, and yet is also feeling the tug of religious piety while he's still being seduced by the Hollywood of it all at the same time. But then there was also the question of, well, why tell the story now? What does the story have to say to people in 2024? And I had to solve that part of it. And eventually I said, okay, he's telling the story to his grandson, who has run off instead of embracing his acceptance to Cornell University, being the first member of his family to go to college. He's run off to the Middle East to join a holy war, and he's about to make the same mistakes that his grandfather made. And so it became a kind of epistolary novel and a conversation between grandfather and grandson. And that's how this Scheherazade tale unfolds.
Right. And Peter, at what point
to come up to that? Yeah.
Yeah. When did you? I imagine that was not the first draft or the second draft. That wasn't your initial approach.
Or the 102nd or the 103rd draft either.
Yeah.
It had a completely different main character who is no longer in the book at all. It had an American character and an American story in the foreground, which people today might say, well, that's as it should be. It didn't work. It didn't work. And I had a series of interesting themes, but I didn't have a story. And there's a big difference, and I had to grapple with that. And I started writing the book in 2003. I came up with this idea of having the grandfather telling it to his grandson in 2020 during the
Right.
pandemic. That that was a long. I did a
That's a
lot of
long time.
other things in between, but it's a long time to stick
Now,
with.
in just two things I want to mention for people who haven't read the book yet. One is it is an epistolary novel, and you conceal that so beautifully
Yeah,
because every now and then the grandfather will refer to the grandson by name in the middle of a narrative. And it's really beautifully done because it's not clunky. It doesn't sound like a letter or an email. And by the insertion of the name, you remind us of this technique that you're using.
right.
The other thing that you do so well is you don't assume, how do I say this? You don't assume we know things we don't know.
Yeah, yeah.
And yet you also don't tell us things we already know.
Right. That's the tough part.
Right. I am very grateful for the times that you spend 3 or 4 words in a clause to tell me what that word just meant.
Right. Right. But it's a tough thing to figure out. And listen, that's tough to figure out when you're talking to somebody at a party and you're telling them a story. You don't want to be the jerk who mansplains things to people, right? Like
Right, right,
no one wants that. But you don't want to be the nutcase who's talking about things that people don't know what you're referring to at all. When I started writing the book, Cecil B. DeMille was much more remembered than he is nowadays.
yes, yes,
And I've had that question for people under the age of 45. Do you know who I'm talking about when I talk about Yul Brynner and Charlton Heston? And so I try and give you enough clues without hitting you over the head in the way I'm telling the story. And that's part of the reason why it was important to make it a conversation in the
right.
book between the grandfather and the grandson, because the grandfather can occasionally stop and say to the grandson, hey, there used to be this guy, he's a big movie star, Charlton Heston, or there used to be this guy, Nasser, who was the leader of the Middle East. And the grandson is like, yeah, right. Uh, Standing up for the reader, in a sense.
Well, there I can think of 2 sections in the book where you give a little wink to us older readers.
Yeah,
And very much in passing, you refer to Charlton Heston's appreciation of guns,
yeah, yeah.
and you make reference to Yul Brynner's chain smoking.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Except the Yul Brenner thing is actually completely true.
Yeah, 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 sure.
That when he was on the set and he's wearing his pharaoh costume with the brass breastplate and the headdress and all that, he would stand in his chariot and occasionally he would make the V sign with his fingers that we now associate with the peace sign, but this was 1954. And what that V sign actually meant was he was signaling to the assistant, bring me a cigarette because I'm dying up here.
That's funny. Peter, in those 17 years, did you lose hope?
Yes, frequently. Um, the book was rejected, I think, by almost every single publisher that anybody would have heard of. I think almost all but one of the top tier publishers, most of what the agent at the time referred to as the second tier publishers, I think there might have been a few third tier publishers who just said, just in case you're thinking of submitting this book, don't. Uh, at that
Well,
point,
how did you get your hope back?
I had never heard of anybody failing that spectacularly. But it's, because usually you hear these stories and now and then I believe in there was a happy ending. And then year 10 in this case is like, no, I don't think that's going to happen. I think I just couldn't let go of the story. I just knew there was something on the other side of that brick wall that I needed to get to. And there can be a question, and it's an important one to ask yourself. Am I just being hard headed for the sake of being hard headed? Do I just not want to admit defeat? Am I just doing this just to prove that I can? And that can be very dangerous. Actually, you can waste a lot of time in your life. I think, but when you write a book, you have to get up every morning and you have to convince yourself this is the most important thing that I could be doing. This is absolutely a story that the world needs to hear. I mean, it's delusional, it's crazy, but I had been living with that delusion for so long that I couldn't erase it completely. And during the pandemic, I couldn't do the kind of research firsthand that I normally do. And I wasn't working for a television show, which I've done on and off over the years as well. And I thought, look, I've got this one more idea of how I can write this book. And I don't care if nobody else publishes it. I don't care if two other people read it. I have to see this thing through to its conclusion. And I have this new way of telling the story. And I'm convinced that this is the right way to do it. And Jim, I think you and I both come from this generation where there were a lot of musicians who would say this. I don't know if they meant it in retrospect. I don't care if this album sells.
Right.
I just have to get this music out in the world.
Right.
I just have to sing my song. Well, I just had to sing my song. It wasn't about whether this sells a million copies. I just had to put it out there into the world, and if it connects with people, great. And if it doesn't, it's off my chest.
Right. You can't do that with your second album.
No.
You have to have a reservoir of trust with your listeners, and you have to have it with your readers. And I would say the authors that I love, and that includes Peter Blauner, I would say, well, if he thinks this is worthy, then I'm gonna think it's worthy too. But yeah, regarding Cecil B. DeMille, I have two questions regarding Cecil B. DeMille. One is, how would you have handled him as a screenwriter? And secondly, I understand that his family had something to say about this book.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think I would have handled him as a screenwriter by hiding under my desk whenever he entered into the office and remaining very, very quiet until I was sure he was gone, and then getting back into my chair and muttering curses under my breath, because he was notoriously tough with writers. His family were crucial in the writing of this book. Very early on, I met his grandson and his granddaughter, Cece, who actually was there in 1954 and on the set of the Ten Commandments, and was a firsthand witness to many of the events that I describe in the book, and opened many doors in terms of introducing me to people and literally allowing me to see the archive where the costumes were and where the leopard skin adorned chariots were, and all those things. And it's really a wonderful person. So when I finally got this book written, and I finally convinced Minotaur St. Martin's Books to publish it, as soon as I got a bound copy of the book in my hands, I sent it to Cece, and she got back to me pretty quickly. And she said, you were pretty tough on the old man. I said, yeah, I know, because DeMille comes off pretty harshly in some sections of the book. She said, he was responsible for a lot of people and a lot of money for the studio. And if he had to be harsh, there was a reason why. I said, yeah, Cece, I get it. She said, but I love the book. And actually went out of her way to give me a quote to show to people that she really felt this was the way it was. And that was really meaningful.
I bet. Peter, you're on Substack now,
Yes.
and as I've told you that I'm a big fan of your Substack because it reminds me of Pete Hamill and Murray Kempton and Jimmy Breslin, and I love that style of journalism, and I don't see enough of it anymore. Um, you couldn't stay away, could you?
No, yeah, like a serial killer. I felt an uncontrollable compulsion. I mean, it's also like if you spend 20 years writing a novel, you want to get your words out there again, and it's the opposite. Maybe too much so that like I write it and then I just hit send and then it's out there, and I enjoy the interaction with people who read the material. That just in the same way that Pete and Breslin and Murray would put their columns out into the world, and people sometimes would come up to them and say, "You blew it. You got it wrong. You don't know what the hell you're talking about," or "You got it right. You told my story. You sang my song," and and that's its own kind of gratification. And listen, a lot of my career has been spent um, in journalism, working for publications like New York Magazine. I've also written for these television shows like Law and Order, SVU, and Blue Bloods. But a lot of people have a say in the way those products come out. You're just a link in the chain, and if you think you're more than that, well, you're sadly mistaken, and there'll be somebody who sets you straight on that, and that's great. Some of those people that I've worked with are wonderful, and some of them are very dear friends of mine, but it's not the same thing as having the intimate one-to-one connection you have as writer and reader that you can have writing a novel into in a different, much more offhanded way in something like this column.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Peter Blauner, I want to thank you for being my guest on Writers at Work. I wish you continued success with Pitcher in the Sand and whatever you're up to next. All the best, Peter.
Thanks, Jim.
Writers at Work is a production of Bliss Publications. Erin Mitchell is our producer. Music is by Joni Mitchell, performed by Keith Jarrett. For more, see writersatworkpodcast.com. I'm your host, Jim Fusilli. Until next time, happy reading.